Folks, she shouldn't be allowed to run. Okay, shouldn't. There's virtually no doubt that FBI Director Comey and the great special agents of the FBI will be able to collect more than enough evidence to garner indictments against Hillary Clinton and her inner circle, despite her efforts to disparage them and to discredit them. If she were to win this election, it would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis. In that situation, we could very well have a sitting president under felony indictment and ultimately a criminal trial. It would grind government to a halt.
Wow.
Well, that was then candidate Donald Trump just 3 days before the 2016 election, saying a president under felony indictment would grind the government to a halt and create a constitutional crisis. He got the premise right, just the players wrong, as he is now the first former U.S. president and candidate to be convicted of a crime.
I mean, this is what he said. She should not be able to run. It would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis if someone with a felony was running for president and got elected. It would grind government to a halt. Also, taking note that at that time, Donald Trump actually didn't despise the FBI and hate the FBI. He actually loved the FBI because it's all situational, just like he loves this country in a situational way, just like too many of his supporters only love this country if Donald Trump is president of the United States. And if Donald Trump's not the president of the United States, they turn on the men and the women of the FBI. They turn on America. They turn on American democracy. They say this country is horrible. It's all very situational, not the way I was raised. I love this country. I don't turn flags upside down. If my candidate doesn't win, I don't lie for 4 years and say my candidate really won elections. It's crazy. But she would be unable to, she should not be able to run an unprecedented constitutional crisis.
The country would grind to a halt.
I mean, so the question, Mika, is really here. Again, it's never about Trump.
No.
It's about, how's it going on your phone?
Just getting your coffee hot.
Oh, you want it hot?
You want it hot.
Okay.
I was letting them know.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's very kind of you.
You're welcome.
So,
Someone's got to do it.
You must have thought I was lagging here and I wasn't awake enough. But, I mean, it's not Donald Trump that we're surprised by. It's the people that continue to follow a guy who is so clearly a hypocrite, who so clearly is situational, who goes from saying he loves the FBI to hating the FBI, who goes from saying America is the worst country in the world to saying America is great again, and then when he loses, saying he didn't lose and America is a terrible country again. And, you know, his family calls this country a shithole country. America, the greatest country on the face of the earth. By just about every measure. I mean, I believe that. I love America. And I love America. I love America. I don't see it through the prism of who's sitting in the White House on whether this is a great country or not. It's a great country. Sometimes I think some presidents are better than others, but my God, it's staggering.
Yeah.
That Donald Trump's supporters,
that's what's staggering,
convince themselves that they hate America because Donald Trump says he hates America because America is weak. And they rag on the military all the time. They say it's weak and woke. We got the most powerful military in the world. They rag on our economy, saying our economy's terrible. Some saying, oh, it's going toward a depression. We have the strongest economy in the world. Relative to the rest of the world, there's not a close second. America is more powerful today than it has been in a very long time relative to the rest of the world. That's just the reality of it.
Despite what you think of Joe Biden, but I think the thing that's most troubling and scary and frightening about this and deadly serious is the Republican Party and the RNC.
It's sad.
That part of this equation is where we don't know how this ends.
It's sad, and it's sad primarily for the Republican Party because they're going to lose again. And after all these years of losing from 2017 through 2023, Jonathan Lemire, you think they would have learned by now. I'm dead serious here. You think they would have, occasionally some people will get on other shows and say, they're always attacking the Republican. I'm here. I've been on a mission of mercy since 2016, trying to save the Republican Party from themselves.
Deeply generous.
They haven't listened, and they've lost. They didn't listen in 2017, and they lost. They didn't listen in 2018, and they lost. They didn't listen in 2019, and they lost. 2020, they lost. 21, they lost. 22, 23, they lost. And so they always think they're so clever. They always think they're so tough. They're the 1962 New York Mets. And at some point, somebody needs to wake up and go, hey, guys, we suck at this game of politics. We need a new manager.
Think of the moments that Republicans could have cut Donald Trump loose. They could have parted ways with him. Right after the November 2020 election, they chose not to. Right after January 6th and that subsequent impeachment trial, when it did seem like he was at his low water mark, they chose not to. During the January 6th committee hearings, when all that was resurfaced for national consumption, they chose not to. After the 2022 midterms, when Trump's candidates, particularly for the Senate, lost, where Donald Trump lost, and people were questioning whether he should even run again, and he rushed his campaign announcement, and there was a sense he was doing so to try to avoid prosecution, that it wasn't actually being anything good for the party. They could have done it then. They chose not to. And now, during the primary process, they could have gone another direction. Trump refused to even debate his rivals. Republicans chose not to. E. Jean Carroll, and now this. A moment where there's a criminal conviction, and not only are Republicans not cutting Donald Trump loose, they're wrapping themselves even tighter to him, with very few exceptions. Republicans have come out in recent days and denounced this as a travesty of justice, rallied behind Donald Trump, and suggested that this was a Department of Justice witch hunt, that it was a political prosecution, and they have attached their fate to his yet again. And there is no sense that that's going to change between now and November. And we are seeing, as we'll get into this morning, some early polls that suggest modest but real movement away from Trump after this conviction. Their warning signs are there for these Republicans, and they're ignoring them.
And that's the thing, Mika, is maybe Marco Rubio thinks attacking juries plays well with his base. I'm not so sure. I mean, I think most Americans respect other Americans that sit for 6 weeks, do a good job. Even Trump's own attorney said the jury was serious. They did a good job, but
paid attention.
They paid attention, and he did not find fault with them at all. He said that they paid attention and did their job. But you get Marco Rubio and other Republicans who, again, because they want Donald Trump to notice them, attack an institution like America's jury system, and then compares the United States of America, the USA, compares us to Castro's communist Cuba.
Who are you?
It is, what's happened to Marco Rubio? Where is he? Because that is so deeply unsettling. Not for us, for him, for the Republican Party, for the people who vote for him, for the people who vote for this Republican Party. Because you're losing when you talk this way, when you attack the rule of law, when you attack the FBI, when you attack jurors, maybe you get $25 in fundraising, like, blitzes, but you lose independent voters. You lose swing voters in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and you lose elections. And they keep doing this, and they keep losing elections. And I wonder, how long can they keep going off the cliff for this guy?
At some point, people who are cluing into this election, which historically starts to happen in the months and days before an election, they're going to see all these Republicans saying this is the Biden Justice Department. They're going to be parroting Trump, who says it's Biden, it's Biden. Well, Hunter Biden is going to court. So Biden must be the worst co-opter of the Justice Department on earth if this is the Biden Justice Department, which we all know there's no evidence of that in this New York criminal trial where Trump was convicted of 34 felony counts. 34 across the board from beginning to end. Every single count was guilty. That's resounding. So, good luck with that argument. Well, it only lasts until people start reading.
Well, yeah.
New polling from ABC News and Ipsos is giving us our first snapshot at how independent voters feel about last week's verdict. Although 45% say the verdict was politically motivated, more than half of all independents, 52%, believe the jury reached the right conclusion and think it should end Donald Trump's 2024 campaign. Those numbers are even higher among voters with unfavorable opinions of both Trump and President Joe Biden, those so-called double haters. Among that group, 65% say the verdict was correct, and 67% say it should end Trump's bid for the White House. So they
keep this up for a second.
Agree with Donald Trump. How we came in on the show here.
Yeah, so Sam Stein, we're looking at this double haters. Everybody's talking about the double haters, people that don't like Biden, people that don't like Trump. It's actually, if you dig into that, they are, of course, pollsters say they're the most important group. If you dig into it, you actually get a lot of animosity towards Donald Trump. And with Joe Biden, it's like, he's too old. He's all right. He's a good guy. Too old. Don't want him in there. So double haters actually is a bit of a misnomer. But they always seem to break overwhelmingly Biden's way. And here we see it again. 67% of this undecided group that's going to determine the outcome of the election think that the convictions should end Donald Trump's campaign. What say you, Mr. Stein?
Well, I think it's an alarming number. If you're Donald Trump, obviously, you can't afford to bleed that type of support anywhere. But that block in particular, you need to break to you specifically, right? I mean, he's going to win his voters. We know that. What he really needs in this election is those people who are on the fence, maybe a little bit wary of Joe Biden, breaking all the way his way. That said, I'm going to hold my judgments for polls that are not snapshot polls. That's right after the verdict. People may be reacting to the news. We're also 5 months out. As Jonathan pointed out, rightfully at the top of this, we have a lengthy history of people circling back towards Trump after egregious, seemingly crippling political moments, January 6th top among them. So let's wait and see and be sober about these polling numbers. I will say, look, it obviously doesn't benefit Donald Trump to have 34 guilty counts against him. It's not something that any candidate would want. I think he's trying to turn it into some sort of political favor. I don't think it's ignorance that other Republicans are comparing it to the show trials of the Stalin era. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They're not ignorant of it. They're trying to discredit the justice system because that's the card that they have to play here. The question, Joe, that you raised is, will the public, or at least will a good portion of the public, look at that and say, you know what, I'm all for it? Or will they say, you know what, our foundational system of government and the rule of law is too important? And it was telling to me that when Joe Biden came out and offered his first remarks on the trial last week, he did not go after the substance of the verdict. No one expected him to do that. What he did is he got really heated about the efforts by Republicans to undermine faith in the rule of law. And I think that's where he wants to point his anger, and that's the case he wants to make heading into the election.
Yeah, and the politics of this are going to be so fascinating because, yes, there's polling that shows that there is a percentage of Republicans who won't vote for Trump. At least they say they won't vote for Trump now that he's a convicted felon. But we're seeing the vast majority of the GOP in a frenzy and repeating Trump talking points, really trying to create an echo chamber about how unfair this verdict was. Now, let's see what Democrats do. We knew the president, that was the right thing to do, most people believe. His first remarks simply about we need to respect the process. But now what do fellow Democrats do? What does the campaign do? Eventually, what does the president himself do in terms of driving home this conviction as example of why Donald Trump is not fit for office? So now let's turn to the legal part of this and bring in former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Lisa, I hope you've had a chance to catch your breath after such a frenzied stretch. And we are a couple days out from the verdict now. Any sort of additional reactions now that you've had time to sit with this as to how it went down, and give us your latest thoughts as to what the prosecution may seek in terms of penalty?
Let's start there. I think that the prosecution, notwithstanding Donald Trump's efforts to say that the people won't stand for his serving any jail time, I would be very surprised if the Manhattan DA's office doesn't seek some form of jail time here. And the reason is for two reasons, John. One is the severity of the conduct. We're talking about 34 counts, each of which could be punished by up to 4 years. Of course, they're not going to seek 4 years for each of these counts. Rather, they'd ask for some sort of concurrent sentence where they're all grouped together. But it's hard for me to imagine that given the multiplicity of counts here, they're not going to seek some jail time. The other major factor, however, is the lack of remorse shown by the defendant. Not only do we have a defendant who's already been found in criminal contempt 10 times, but he continues to say things about the verdict, about the process, about participants in the process who are covered by the gag order in theoretical violations of that gag order that haven't been brought to Justice Merchan's attention. That could be a part of any sentencing procedure. When he goes out and says, for example, that this is all a Biden administration-led cabal because one of the prosecutors here happened to have served in the Biden Department of Justice. That's the only connection at all that they can draw. That is a person who shows no remorse, a person who says the process is rigged, that the judge is corrupt, that the district attorney didn't want to bring this case but only did so under political pressure. That is a person who doesn't believe that they did anything wrong, as he continues to say, and I expect that to play a major factor in his sentencing.
You know, Lisa, one of the questions that I've had is, obviously we have no precedent for a former sitting president to be convicted of a felony on 34 counts. At the same time, if you're the judge, Judge Merchan must be thinking, okay, you know, I have to look at precedent in terms of sentencing. What is fair? And so are there high profile cases that you think he may be looking at? Are there, other examples that we can look to say, well, this might be what it looks like? I mean, what would be fair? I mean, there's no precedent. We're just kind of running blind here.
Judge Merchan is a person who historically has not been particularly lenient with white-collar defenders. It is also not the case, despite what Trump and his allies continue to say, that falsification of business records as a felony is not a traditionally prosecuted crime in Manhattan. In fact, it gets prosecuted all the time. What might be novel here is the combination of falsification of business records and an election law conspiracy under state law. It's New York election law 17152. That's the crime that Trump says nobody had any idea of what I was being accused of. That's not true at all. But again, if you're looking historically at have people committed falsification of business records that get bumped up to a felony because there is an underlying crime that they either intended to commit or conceal, that happens all the time in Manhattan, and Justice Merchan will take that into consideration.
You know, my revenge will be success, and I mean that. But it's awfully hard when you see what they've done. These people are so evil. And at the same time, the country can come together. You know, I'm saying this, but the country can come together.
You famously said regarding Hillary Clinton, lock her up. You declined to do that as president.
I beat her. It's easier when you win. And they all said lock her up. And I felt, and I could have done it, but I felt it would have been a terrible thing. And then this happened to me. And so I may feel differently about it. I can't tell you. I'm not sure I can answer the question. Hillary Clinton, I didn't say lock her up, but the people would all say lock her up, lock her up. Okay. Then we won. And I said pretty openly, I say, all right, come on, just relax. Let's go. We got to make our country great. Every time I mention her, everyone screams, lock her up, lock her up, lock her up. They keep screaming. And you know what I do? I've been nice. But after watching that performance last night, such lies, I don't have to be so nice anymore. I used to say just a couple of weeks ago, let's just beat her on November 8th. But you know what? You have a point. Crooked Hillary Clinton. Oh, she's crooked, folks. She's crooked as a $3 bill. Okay, here's one. Just came out. Lock her up is right. Tell you what, for what she's done, they should lock her up. She's disgraceful. It's disgraceful. So crooked Hillary, crooked, you should lock her up, I'll tell you. Lock up the Bidens. Lock up Hillary. Lock them up.
That final one was just a few weeks before the 2020 election, when he was calling for the imprisonment of his political opponent.
So I guess he agrees with...
by his attorney general. And he kept saying, despite the lies to the Fox and Friends weekend crew, which, of course, they didn't challenge him after he said that, he said, lock her up repeatedly, joined in, agreed with the crowd repeatedly. The guy completely... And this idea, Jonathan Lemire, that he didn't push after he was president of the United States to investigate Hillary, he did time and again. And time and again, his attorney generals came back and said, there's nothing to indict her on.
Yeah, I was struck by how many of those rallies, both in 2016 and 2020, I attended. And this was one of the signature pieces of his act, was the lock her up chants from the crowd that he would egg on and eventually would say he agreed with. And as president, we're no longer a candidate, as president, with the power of the government behind him, he absolutely asked Attorney General Jeff Sessions and later Bill Barr if there were means to prosecute the Clintons, and the answer was no. And then, as you just mentioned, there in the fall of 2020, we could see the polls and see that he was losing to Joe Biden. He pushed Bill Barr to investigate the Bidens as well. That, of course, did not come to pass, but there was one of the reasons why
Well, and he said lock him up. He said the Bidens should be locked up. And he said that 2 weeks before the election. I mean, you talk about something straight out of Russia. There's a reason he admires Putin. There's a reason he admires Orban. There's a reason he's in love with Kim Jong-un. He and President Xi, why he says President Xi is so brilliant, he loves that they have the power of authoritarians, and that's what he wants, and that's what he's promising his voters they'll get if they vote for him.
Yeah, in that same interview over the weekend, he said that they would go after, if he were to win again, his Department of Justice would go after his political foes. He thinks that would be fair play because of this case in Manhattan, which, of course, we know Joe Biden, President Biden, had nothing to do with. And if there's any better evidence of President Biden not being involved with the intricacies of the DOJ, it's that his son, Hunter Biden, his beloved son, Hunter Biden, his own trial starts in just a few hours in Delaware.
So joining the conversation, we have the president of the National Action Network and host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, Reverend Al Sharpton, and NBC News and MSNBC political analyst, former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill. She and Jen Palmieri, co-hosts of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024.
So
good to have you.
So Senator Claire McCaskill. Former prosecutor. Talk about Donald Trump, his lies over the weekend, saying he never called for Hillary Clinton to be locked up, and how the guy who actually promoted the politicalization of the Justice Department the most is the one now lying, claiming that it was Joe Biden who started this investigation in 2018 before he was even the Democratic nominee, and was somehow responsible for a New York grand jury and a New York jury of 12 finding Donald Trump unanimously guilty on 34 counts of felonies.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is that the Republicans who are denigrating the institutions that make sure we have a rule of law in this country that applies to everyone, these folks are advocating for red state DAs to go out and prosecute Democrats. And Donald Trump, when he got in the White House, wanted the Justice Department to bend to his will and go after his political opponents. What they forget is the most essential ingredient in our rule of law is evidence. And evidence is not a Democrat. Evidence is not a Republican. Evidence is not a communist or a libertarian or a socialist. Evidence is what comes into court for juries to consider. And the reason that Donald Trump is being prosecuted is not complicated. It's because of the evidence. And I thought this interview was astounding in so many ways. How about him firing all the generals and putting in MAGA loyalists? Can you imagine what that would do to our military? Can you imagine the upheaval that would cause within a military that is so important right now with the world in the kind of, on knife's edge in terms of the Middle East and in terms of what Russia's trying to do, China's desire in terms of what they want to do with their power in that part of the world. So I listen. And when the mask slipped, Joe, when he said, "It's easier when you win," that phrase was really interesting to me because it for a moment there, he was acknowledging that he ran once and didn't win.
Yeah. Rev, the thing that, of course, his voters should know about Donald Trump, but they won't. But the thing that everybody else needs to understand, those swing voters who are going to decide who is the next president of the United States, is this is a guy that does not respect American democracy unless elections turn out in his favor. And he doesn't respect the rule of law, which actually I think is the bedrock of our constitutional republic. He doesn't respect the rule of law unless it gets to the outcome that serves him the best. And this weekend on Politics Nation, you actually interviewed someone who can tell that story as well as anybody, and it is very personal to him because Donald Trump was calling for this man's execution even after we all knew he was innocent.
Donald Trump, who never took a public position on any race case in New York, and I'm talking about killings in Howard Beach, killings in Bensonhurst. I mean, people killed because of the color of their skin. But when 5 young black and brown young men, teenagers, were arrested and charged with raping and beating a white woman in Central Park, and some of us stood up and said, wait a minute, these people's families are saying they didn't do it, they weren't there, it doesn't make sense. They were convicted. Donald Trump, who never took a position on anything else, took out full-page ads, actually spent money. He's notorious for not paying bills, spent money in 5 newspapers and called for them to be given the death penalty. And after DNA evidence proved that none of the 5 were there, he still refused to back down. And so one of the 5, who's now a member of the city council, came on my show this weekend, because as we see these polls talking about black men moving away from Trump, they need to know what they're moving toward. Here's a man who committed himself to the execution of young black men, even when the evidence was the other way. Here's a man that was, many of us are adversaries of the stop and frisk policy. Nobody was closer to Rudy Giuliani and stop and frisk than Donald Trump. So young black men are looking at someone who has never regarded the letter of law for anybody, not just blacks, but specifically for blacks when he raised it. But he had no respect for law at all. When you have a man that now talks about judges and others like there's something wrong with them if they judge him, it is a threat to all of us. And I think that we need to understand this election is more than a race between two older men. This is about where we're going to have law in this country.
Well, and he doesn't respect the judges. He doesn't respect the rule of law. He doesn't respect American democracy unless he wins. When he loses, he undermines it. He attacks America. He says America's horrible. But also, let's talk about the jury.
Yeah.
Him going after the jury, even when his lawyer said the jury did a very good job. But think about the sacrifice those jurors made for 6 weeks, away from work, away from home, away from their families, away from their lives, under incredible stress. Now being doxxed. Now Trump people trying to dox them, trying to find out who they are, to terrorize them, the threats. These people sacrificed an awful lot.
Yeah.
And for Marco Rubio to
feed into that,
to feed into the hatred, to feed into the threats by saying that this is like Castro's
disgraceful.
Cuba, for other Republicans to feed into that by suggesting that these American citizens who did their civic duty, who went and sat for 6 weeks, that somehow they're in line with Joseph Stalin and just the heinous show trials of the 1930s in the Soviet Union. It's unspeakable. And make no mistake, these Republicans that attack the jurors, that attack the decision, that attack the judicial system, and make those comparisons with the worst dictators of the 20th century, all they're doing is they're putting the lives of the judge, the family, the jurors, everybody in danger.
Yeah. November's presidential election has implications well beyond our country's borders. And a new piece in The Atlantic entitled "What Europe Fears" details how European leaders and NATO are preparing for the potential re-election of Donald Trump. And joining us now, the author of that piece, staff writer at The Atlantic, McKay Coppins. McKay, thank you for coming on this morning. So tell us what these leaders are saying.
You know, I was struck traveling through Europe and talking to all these leaders by two things. One is that they're watching the U.S. election very, very closely. Thomas Bagger, the state secretary in Germany, actually told me that in a year when billions of people around the world will have the opportunity to vote, the one election everyone in Europe cares about and is paying attention to is the American presidential election. The other thing that struck me is that almost every official I spoke to believed that Donald Trump was going to win again. And they say that with a sense of dread, in some cases bordering on panic, honestly. You know, the word that I heard most often in these interviews was existential. They said if Donald Trump comes back, you know, we made it through the first Trump term, right? And it took a toll on the transatlantic relationship, but they made it through. They said if he comes back, given what he's been saying about NATO, given what he's been saying about Russia, the war in Ukraine, they're really afraid that it will be the end of NATO and the beginning of a new stage of Russian aggression that Europe, frankly, isn't prepared for without America's support.
So, McKay, let's dive into that a little bit more. There's been, from President Macron of France in particular, this effort to try to make European more independent, or should we at least say less dependent on the U.S. In terms of our military and financial strength. What other steps are he and his fellow European leaders taking to try to, if you will, Trump-proof what they're doing right now ahead of his possible return?
Yeah, there have been a number of efforts recently proposed. One of them, as you mentioned, is, developing defense autonomy in Europe in a way that would potentially channel funds away from NATO, which really does rely on America, and toward the European Defense Alliance. There's been talk of taking the responsibility for arming Ukraine, the literal logistical responsibility, out of America's hands and putting that in NATO's hands, because they don't know if a future Trump administration administration would abandon the war or not. And really, the biggest change has been that a lot of European allies are spending a lot more now on their own defense. And this is one thing that, Trump takes credit for. And I have to say, a lot of the European officials I spoke to actually grudgingly gave him some credit for. They said, Trump, by kind of being so vociferous about this issue that European allies aren't spending enough on defense, has sort of bullied a lot of these countries into spending more. But it's come at a cost. And that cost is that these European countries, while they are now spending more on collective defense, contributing more to NATO, also don't trust America as a long-term ally the way that they have for the last 75 years. And when America becomes an unpredictable power or a transactional power, that changes the entire global order in ways that I don't think we can predict right now.
Sure does.
Well, and we heard back in, I think it was 2018, 2019, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, saying we can no longer depend on the United States, basically with Trump, because he's so erratic. We're going to have to defend ourselves. It's something Macron has said as well. So it's damning with faint praise, Claire McCaskill, if Donald Trump's making them spend more money on defense, because they're spending more money on defense because they know they can't count on the United States in their minds if Donald Trump is president of the United States. McKay writes this also, that almost every official I spoke with believed that Trump is going to win. And I hear that an awful lot from Europe, and I hear it from across the world. I think, Claire, we should probably tell our friends not to bet too many euros or pounds or rubles on that fact, because what you see on TV may not be what ends up happening in voting booths for swing voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, those three states particularly, where really Biden has never been more than a point or two behind, and in many polls has been ahead in those three states. And those three states are incredibly important. McKay, I wanted to ask you about what's going on in Europe domestically in terms of their politics. We have seen in the United States populism and a really virulent strand of nationalism, anti-immigration that has really roiled our politics here. What is happening in that front in Europe? It looks from a distance that they're having some of the same issues internally within the conservative parties there, the anti-immigration, the populism. Is that something that Europe is also worried about?
Oh, no question. The fear of Trump's return in Europe is of a piece with the fear of a broader rise of right-wing populism and nationalism across Europe. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in Italy. In Germany, the AfD party, which is the far-right party, there was one recent poll that found that 25% of Germans now identify with that party, and that's a pretty extreme party. So there's no question that throughout Western democracies, and really in Europe especially, we've seen a lot of the same forces that have contributed to Trump's rise. And so in some ways, the Europeans kind of understand Trump through that prism. Right? They're saying, we get it. We have our own issues here. Some of our allies have elected leaders like Donald Trump. But it's different when it happens in America, because America is not only the linchpin of NATO alliance, it is in a lot of ways seen as kind of the big brother, right? The European countries rely on America for security. They rely on it for leadership. They rely on America to set an example to the world for what a well-functioning Western democracy should look like. And a lot of the anxiety about this election in Europe stems from the fact that they're seeing this kind of chaos in American democracy and wondering if the city on a hill can still be looked to as an example. And that causes a lot of alarm among our friends in Europe.
Whew, the new piece is online now for The Atlantic. Staff writer McKay Coppins, thank you so much for writing the piece and being on the show this morning. 36 past the hour, Hunter Biden's felony gun trial is set to begin in a Delaware courtroom with the jury selection process. And many members of the Biden family are by his side, including Dr. Jill Biden, who raised him, Ashley Biden, one of his closest friends, Fran Pearson, Jack Owen, President Biden's brother-in-law. and others. And it is Dr. Jill Biden's birthday. And according to the Washington Post, Hunter said, "Happy birthday. I have a special event." And the two laughed. Let's go to NBC News Justice correspondent Ken Dilanian live outside the courthouse. Ken, what's going inside the courtroom right now? This certainly is a big show of family support.
It really is, Mika. Right now, jury selection is underway. 250 jurors have been called. They're going to bring in 50 at a time to ask them a series of questions. As you said, a tough day for the Biden family. We saw Jill Biden walk into this courthouse, and now we have a new statement from the president himself. And I'm just going to read it to you because it's pretty important. He says, "I'm the president, but I'm also a dad. Jill and I love our son, and we're so proud of the man he is today. Hunter's resilience in the face of adversity and the strength he has brought to his recovery are inspiring to us." It goes on, "A lot of families have loved ones who have overcome addiction and know what we mean." He says, "As the president, I don't and won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him, and respect for his strength. Our family has been through a lot together, and Jill and I are going to continue to be there for Hunter and our family with our love and support." Now, that was a pretty carefully worded statement, guys, and it doesn't repeat what President Biden has said in the past where he said his son did nothing wrong. He's careful not to comment on his guilt or innocence in this case because it's a sensitive time where the former president has been convicted of felonies and his supporters are questioning where the fairness of the justice system. And Hunter Biden's attorneys are making some of the same arguments actually in this case where they're arguing that this was a malicious and vindictive prosecution. Again, this is a gun case. This is about a Colt revolver that Hunter Biden owned for 11 days until his then girlfriend threw it in a dumpster. He was using and addicted to drugs at the time, and the government says he violated criminal law by lying on a form that he filled out when he went to buy this gun and then by possessing the gun. This is a charge that is rarely brought in this context, and there was going to be a plea deal, as you recall, last year that called for a deferred adjudication on this charge, and then Hunter Biden was going to plead guilty to misdemeanor tax charges. That fell apart. He's now facing 2 felony trials. This is the first one, and he's facing time in prison, guys.
Ken, so give us a sense as to the timeline of this trial. What should we expect in terms of witnesses produced, what sort of evidence will be discussed, and frankly, how long it may all last?
Jonathan, this is expected to be a 1 to 2 week trial, probably in the middle of that range. Jury selection is expected to take 1 to 2 days. It's a fairly simple case. He filled out the form, and there's going to be testimony about his drug use, including some pretty painful testimony for the Biden family from Hunter Biden's ex-wife, Kathleen Buell, and from Hallie Biden, Beau Biden's widow, who was romantically involved with Hunter Biden after her husband died, and can testify about his drug use. And she was actually the one who took the gun away from him and put it in a dumpster. It was then found by a homeless man, and that's how the police got involved. It's worth noting there were no charges filed at the time. This was 2018. But this conduct and this case arose again when the Justice Department was investigating Hunter Biden's business dealings, and that's what brought us here today.
NBC's Ken Dilanian, thank you very much for your coverage this morning. And
former President Trump overnight saying he hopes to take his case to the country's highest court, posting the Supreme Court must decide, as he now braces for what could come at his sentencing in 6 weeks.
The judge could decide to say, hey, house arrest or even jail. How do you face what that could look like? I'm okay with it.
An extraordinary moment after his unprecedented felony conviction on 34 counts of falsifying business records. The penalty is now ranging from probation to prison time, which is technically possible, legal experts say, but highly unlikely.
I'm not sure the public would stand for it. I think it would be tough for the public to take. You know, at a certain point, there's a breaking point.
That ominous-sounding suggestion coming in an interview before Mr. Trump's appearance at a UFC fight Saturday night, as he also tries to distance himself from those lock her up chants about his 2016 opponent, Hillary Clinton.
They all said lock her up, and I felt, and I could have done it, but I felt it would have been a terrible thing. And then this happened to me. Hillary Clinton, I didn't say lock her up, but the people would all say lock her up, lock her up.
In reality, though Clinton was never convicted of any crime, Mr. Trump did say lock her up repeatedly.
For what she's done, they should lock her up. Lock her up is right.
Since the conviction Thursday, the RNC says the committee and campaign have raised $70 million online, a massive haul.
There's no doubt that this verdict has actually brought unifying our party.
But multiple polls this weekend find majorities of Americans agreeing with the guilty verdict, with the Biden-Trump race overall remaining deadlocked, as it's been for months. Most top Republicans falling in line behind the presumptive GOP nominee.
We have to fight back, and we will, with everything in our arsenal. But we do that within the confines of the rule of law.
As President Biden himself issues a warning about GOP rhetoric.
And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
I completely agree with the president. I will say, words do matter. And I noticed something different with what Mike Johnson said compared to Donald Trump. Donald Trump says we're at the breaking point. And Mike Johnson there said we must fight back. But he said we must fight back within the confines of the rule of law. Well, that's important. That's important. That's like, it's all right for us to say we have to fight politically at the ballot box, et cetera, et cetera. That's how politicians have always spoken until we get to Donald Trump, who talks about, telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, or saying come to Washington on January 6th, it will be wild, or saying, Lawrence O'Donnell, that we are at a, quote, breaking point. Coded language for a man who started the worst riot, political riot in American history in Washington, D.C. since the Civil War. This guy was the author of that riot, and now it looks like he's trying to provoke again.
Yeah, and Joe, it's obviously aspirational on his part. When he says breaking point, he's hoping for the breaking point.
Right.
But he saw the crowds that did not show up at the Manhattan courthouse. And you'll remember that he summoned them just before the indictment was announced last year, and they didn't come. They never showed up. So, people think, oh, well, there's no Trump voters in New York City. There's 85,000 of them on the island of Manhattan alone. 85,000 of them. When you add in Brooklyn, Queens, nearby New Jersey, northern suburbs, there's a few million Trump voters within an hour of that courthouse. They did not come. They are not motivated to go out there and protest for him over his conduct with Stormy Daniels and what he did to cover it up. And I don't believe that there is any serious threat of what Donald Trump would be hoping for, which is some kind of rerun of January 6th. You got to remember how many of those people are in prison, and the rest of them, their mothers are telling them, don't do that again. And I just don't think that threat is really there.
Yeah, the thing is, it's also interesting that you look at the polls, Lawrence, that Hallie had in her piece. I mean, two polls, one of them was something like 57% to 27%. I saw it very quickly, but it was like a 25, 30-point spread on people who believed the conviction was the right result in the trial. And then you have Republicans coming out and saying, oh, the United States is like Castro's Cuba. The United States is like Stalin's Soviet Union. I know a lot of people freak out, their hair gets on fire, they run around in circles. All I see is a former politician. I'm sure all you see is somebody that has been in this world forever. I just see a party moving further and further and further away from the very independents and swing voters they have to pick up in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, they absolutely are, Joe. And when you look at that number, 57% think the verdict was correct. That's without those people being able to watch the trial on TV. If they could have watched it on TV, that number would have been significantly higher, because they would have seen that Judge Juan Merchan was the model of what they would hope a judge would be if a member of their family was on trial in that courtroom. They would see that the Trump lawyers were winning all sorts of arguments with the judge all the time. The judge was sustaining their objections. The judge was agreeing with them in certain motions arguments that they made. And no one got to see that. Donald Trump got to go out and tell his followers how bad the judge was every day, even when the judge was ruling in Donald Trump's favor. And so television would have really shown everyone just how fair this was. And there'd be the hardcore who would absolutely never agree that it was a fair trial. But 57% thinking that was a fair outcome without even being able to see it.
Wow.
The television would have been the most valuable asset in this particular trial.
Also with us this morning, the host of Morning Edition and Up First on NPR, Steve Inskeep, and Washington Post opinion editor and writer Alexi McCammond. Also, Politico's Jonathan Lemire, of course, is still with us.
I mean, this is just like an all-star cast. You know, when I was
It
growing up,
is.
they had like Night of the Thousand Stars.
And here we are.
We got him here in the morning.
In the fourth hour.
It's really pretty incredible. Steve, let me go to you. Let's put these polls up again. And again, they're only polls, they're only snapshots. I certainly understand that. At the same time, when you have this ABC Ipsos poll, a 50 to 27 split, CBS a 57 to 43 split. Again, this could all change, but I would tell you these snapshots certainly show the Republican Party. 27% may believe that verdict makes us Castro's Cuba or Stalin's Soviet Union, but I doubt even those people are buying the Republican line right now.
Maybe not a lot of people are buying that line, but I suppose one of the questions is how much difference does it ultimately make in the election, in people's votes? I've looked at different surveys about that. I'm sure you have as well. And I also, to understand that, tried to look a little bit into history to ask what happens when somebody who's been convicted of a felony, who's even served prison time, runs again, and sometimes in a democracy, people vote for that guy. In the city where I am right now, Washington, D.C., Marion Barry won a fourth term as mayor after going to prison. James Michael Curley was mayor of Boston after going to prison, served one of his terms while in prison. And I even thought of Hugo Chavez, who was elected in a democratic election in Venezuela as the leader of that country after going to prison for a coup attempt. The reason being, I think, that people vote on their own interests, not the morality of the person that they're voting for. And some political leaders do manage to take their trial, take their conviction, and make it part of a narrative that attracts support. That's going to be one of the things we'll need to watch for in the months ahead.
So, Alexi, let's dive in a little more on the politics of this. We have seen the Republicans already, with only a few exceptions, really rally around Donald Trump, adopt his talking points. This is a witch hunt, and suggest that it was a travesty of justice ordered up by President Biden. Of course, we know that's not true. Democrats, though, seem a little more split into how they're going to handle this. Some have been very aggressive, others far more muted, suggesting they don't want to be seen as, putting their thumb on this scale. President Biden, we heard him speak about the need to respect the verdict. His campaign's been a little more aggressive. We'll see if they go more so. So talk to us about the debate among Democrats as to how to try to capitalize on this, because some have told me, well, why should we talk about it? It's not breaking through. But the counter from other Democrats is, well, isn't it our job to make it break through?
And this is a question that's been plaguing Democrats since Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, as you know well, right? How much should they talk about Donald Trump and his daily controversies? This is obviously more than just a controversy, and it's historic. And so for those reasons, of course, they should talk about it. But Democrats know the perils of adding to the idea that this was just a political hit job against Donald Trump already. I think that what is more effective with voters is not reminding them that he's a convicted felon, no matter what polls say, or, that he was charged on all 34 counts, but using this moment, this conviction, to remind voters of his character, of the underlying facts about who he is that are represented in this case. He lies, he cheats, he steals, he manipulates, he cheats on his wife and has affairs. He will do whatever he needs to do to gaslight you to make sure that his version of reality is accepted. That did not fly in a court of law, and that is what Democrats should remind folks of.